Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We're going to do a little Q&A today. I am just going to cover kind of one specific topic because I've gotten a lot of questions about this in my DMs over the course of the past month or so since the New York Times article titled "Do You Need to Drink Electrolytes" came out on July 21st of 2025. Gotten a lot of messages about this, basically because the gist of the article is no, you don't need to drink electrolytes. Um, so that's been problematic in a lot of different ways, and that's kind of where a lot of the questions have been coming from is, Ollie, what do you think about this? They're saying that you don't need to drink electrolytes and that it doesn't really matter for performance. Like, what are your thoughts on this? So I'm gonna tell you my thoughts. Um, I mean, as someone who has been consulted for New York Times articles in the past, I wish my first kind of beef with this is that I really wish that they consulted some sports dietitians who are actively working with endurance athletes, since they do talk about athletes in this article. I do not think the main audience for this article was meant to be endurance athletes, though. And while they do consult a couple professionals in like the sports nutrition field, they don't focus on one specific population. And this is why I think it's really important to either say this article is for this population when you're going to go talk about really polarizing concepts like this, or approach it with a ton of nuance. And I think they attempted to do that, but kind of failed, especially in the reactions that I've been getting from a lot of different people in my DMs on social media. So essentially, they consulted a couple different professionals, one being like a special surgery nutritionist, which is obviously not someone who's working with endurance athletes, and a couple of professors, sports medicine physicians and scientists. And I believe one of the professors is also a dietitian in the UK or potentially Australia. I wasn't sure which. I didn't look into it too hard, but not really a lot of my colleagues in here. So, when you're approaching an article like this, it's confusing because the audience for the New York Times in general is not going to be primarily endurance athletes. Endurance athletes do not make up the majority of the US population. I think sometimes we think we do because we live in like an echo chamber about endurance athletics, but the basic population is not endurance athletes. And New York Times definitely caters to like more general population. If this was like a Runner's World article, obviously we'd be talking about a completely different audience. If this was like a men's health article, we'd be talking to men. If it's a women's health article, we're talking to women. But this is New York Times. So like they're really talking to everyone. And when we talk about something like electrolytes, that can be problematic because what I'm about to tell you about electrolytes is going to be incredibly nuanced depending on who it is I'm talking to. So while I understand why this article came out, and I do agree with some of it, I definitely don't think it's a helpful or appropriate article for endurance athletes. And if they do want to do an article talking about electrolytes for endurance athletes to clarify some of this, I would be happy to be a consultant again for the New York Times. But I want to talk about this. So in the article, which of course you do have to pay the New York Times platform in order to like read the article, but I'm going to summarize it for you. They cite a lot of different studies, and even while they're citing studies, they say, quote, several small studies. So we're talking about studies that have, like the three that they cited. One's 181 Ironman triathletes who are all male. So we're talking about male triathlon athletes. And 181 is like a solid sample size when it comes to like that population, because there's not a lot of people doing Ironmans, in terms of like population size. And then the other two studies they cited, it was 15 male athletes. And then there was another study with 9 athletes total, 2 of which were female, 7 of which were male. So we're primarily citing very, very, very small research studies that do have, in my opinion, some strengths and some weaknesses, like things like they don't necessarily control for other aspects of the fueling and diet strategy in these studies. A lot of them are focusing on specifically sodium and fluid. They don't assess for things necessarily like GI issues. It's not really clear if they're assessing for dehydration symptoms accumulating over time because these are very short-term studies. A lot of the times it's just a few bouts of exercise. And of course, individual sodium losses are going to vary. So while we do have several individuals over the course of these studies, this is a very small sample size when it comes to science and making really generalized statements to the masses on something like New York Times. So a couple weaknesses there. And also, again, we've got two females in these studies, which is not surprising. There's just not a ton of sports nutrition research on women. But we also know that throughout the female menstrual cycle, body composition, or not body composition, but body temperature changes, which can also affect hydration status, and therefore rehydration needs in sports nutrition for female athletes. So already, the studies they're citing talking about this are not perfect because they're trying to basically get these studies to apply to the general public and also very extreme niche populations like endurance athletes. One of the studies was on Ironman. So we're talking, 10, 11, 12 hours of competition. Another was talking about doing a 2-hour run or cycle, and another talking about doing a 5-hour run. So very extreme levels of exercise, and then we're trying to apply these findings to like the general population. So that already is very problematic. And if you're listening to this thinking, well, I am like an Ironman triathlete or I am an endurance athlete, I do run for hours on end. Do these things apply to me? Just keep listening because I'll dive into this more. So in terms of other things that I really want to think about in this New York Times article, it's very clear to me just with the language that we're not working with endurance athletes. So in particular, in one, particular quote from the nutritionist of special surgery, who obviously is not working with endurance athletes, basically saying you don't need to replace sodium during exercise because you're just going to make it up in your meals. For example, there's potassium in a banana. Okay. So I would argue, because I do work with endurance athletes, lots of them, exclusively pretty much endurance athletes. No, a lot of my endurance athletes are not making up their electrolyte and fluid losses from their workouts in their meals. Can they, if I instruct them to, and like they're super intentional about it? Sure. But habitually, which is what this article is suggesting we do, just drink when you're thirsty and you don't need to worry about sodium. No, most of the people I talk to are absolutely not making up their fluid and sodium losses in meals. They're not going to make up their potassium losses from a 2 or 3 hour workout or even an hour long workout by eating a banana. That's not going to work. Am I saying don't eat bananas? Of course not. But we do need to think about this more because it's going to accumulate over time. We're not just talking about one bout of exercise. We're talking about, 40-mile, 20, 30, 40-mile training week over and over and over and over and over and over again, and marathon training and a lot of exercise that is going to be really depleting for the body. So no, I disagree with the statement saying that you'll just make it up in meals. If you're salting the hell out of your meals and you're consuming a lot of mineral dense, nutritious foods, and you're trying to drink a lot of water, yeah, maybe it's possible, but you're going to have to be super intentional about that in order for it to help. And we are still going to want to replace our sodium and fluid losses while we exercise to negate having to make up for it later for a lot of different reasons. So disagree with that statement. If I'm talking to someone who is sedentary and they went out for a 20-minute walk and that's their exercise for the day and they don't do other exercise throughout the week, like that is their exercise, I agree with the statement. Yeah, you probably will make up whatever you lost in meals. It's super negligible and it's a small amount is what I'm trying to say. So for talking about general population, sure. But I know who's listening to this podcast and who is overlapping with who is listening to the podcast and who is DMing me questions about this article. No, I don't agree with the statement. You do need to think about replacing that aside from just your diet, rather than the general population person, because what you're losing in sweat is a lot different. So the article also talks about essentially losing really large amounts of fluid and causing dehydration, it might be worth replacing water and sodium. So I'm just going to read it to you. When you lose an exceptionally large quantity of water and electrolytes, as you might if you're having a serious bout of diarrhea, you need to replace both. And it's referring to sodium and water. In those situations, doctors often recommend a rehydration solution like Pedialyte, which typically has more sodium and potassium than your average sports drink. Now, yes. So extreme losses, big air quotes there, that applies to not just if you're having a bout of diarrhea, it applies if you're an endurance athlete. A lot of the time, sometimes too, endurance athletes are having bouts of diarrhea, right? And a lot of the times, the root cause of that is not hydrating properly. So we really do want to make sure that we are accounting for this because going out for a run is an example of an extreme amount of loss, especially if you're in hot conditions and especially if you are running for a long period of time and especially if you happen to be a heavier sweater. So Pedialyte, yes, Pedialyte does traditionally have more sodium and potassium than the average sports drink. And when they're talking about the average sports drink, typically in my neck of the woods, we're talking about like Gatorade Thirst Quencher, like the Gatorade in a bottle you can go buy at any grocery store or gas station. And I agree with that. Yeah, that doesn't have a ton of sodium or potassium. And that's why I don't typically recommend plain Gatorade to my endurance athletes. I typically recommend Gatorade Endurance Formula, which does have more sodium and potassium, or a different sports drink like Scratch or Tailwind, which obviously they're not talking about in this article. So I do disagree with that kind of sentiment that the only time you would lose an extreme amount of water and sodium is in a bout of diarrhea, because my clients are doing it every single day. And sometimes it has nothing to do with diarrhea. So actually, we'll probably have less diarrhea if we are hydrating properly with sodium and fluid. So that's definitely something that I want to dissect. I also just think it's a bit of a poorly written article. Not to dig the author, but I do think that as someone who is a professional in this field and who often gets reached out to by different freelance writers to contribute to articles like the New York Times, which I've been featured in, like Self Magazine, which I've been featured in, Livestrong.com, Runner's World, featured in those. A lot of the times you are being asked questions by the writer and they are taking a recording of your conversation or asking you to type out your answers back to them. I do this for free. And that's kind of what they're going to use in the article. Now, it's up to the skill and craft and just knowledge base of the writer and the editing team to put together an article that makes cohesive sense to the layperson and also makes the professionals in the field happy. This is really hard to do, and I commend authors for doing this because it's really hard to gather the information, especially when you don't know everything about the information. When you're not an expert yourself and you don't necessarily even always know what questions to ask because you don't know what you don't know. So that's why when I do get reached out to by organizations and writers like this, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I would love to help you write this article because I'm hoping that by getting my voice out there and speaking for some of my other colleagues who generally have similar observations and approaches as me when it comes to interpreting research and applying it to real humans, I'm hoping that we can put together an article that's accessible to the masses, that makes sense to them, and is going to describe complex topics in an easier, more simple way to understand. And I understand the position of the writer not necessarily always being informed in that subject enough to know what questions to ask. So I'm happy to hop on a call and be like, I think we should talk about this. And a lot of the times they will ask me that. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think like makes sense context wise to ask? Or is there any other background you think we need to provide? I love contributing to this because it's educating the masses. So in this particular article, I do think that there is potentially, maybe there was a little bit of miscommunication or misunderstanding between the writers and the contributors on who they were talking to in terms of the audience. Because I think if you're talking to a sports medicine, I keep combining that word, sports medicine physician, there we go. You know, you would probably talk to the sports med doctor and maybe you're telling them, hey, we're not talking about athletes right now. What about the general population? And they maybe would say things like what they're saying in this article. But then when you put next to their title, sports medicine doctor, and you mentioned endurance athletes earlier in the article, it's very confusing. So I don't know if there was maybe a bit of miscommunication with some of the contributors and the writer and what was said and how this article was put together. But reading it, I'm certainly confused. So I imagine the general public is also confused. And I imagine endurance athletes are even more confused. So I wanted to provide some context there. And one example I'll give to support just my opinion on this, because again, I'm just a person, these are opinions, is the article basically spends a lot of time talking about how you probably don't need electrolytes, even if you are sweating, only in specific, really extreme cases of sweat loss or fluid loss, like diarrhea, right? But we only list that one example. It spends a lot of time talking about how, no, you don't need these things. And then at the end of the article, it talks about a condition called hyponatremia, which it states is quote unquote rare, which is not true in my population. For the general public, yes, hyponatremia, super rare. But for endurance athletes, not rare at all. Actually, potentially occurring in almost 15% of endurance athletes at any given time. So not rare at all, but it spends a lot of time talking about how we don't need electrolytes. And then it talks about hyponatremia, which is basically a condition where your fluid balance becomes imbalanced and there's too much plain water and not enough sodium or electrolytes, but specifically sodium. To counteract that, you can have heart palpitations, irregular heartbeat, dizziness, fainting, and it can be fatal in really extreme circumstances. So it talks about this, and it says drinking too much plain water, especially, in like endurance sports, before, during, and after. This is what typically causes hyponatremia. So it's confusing because one of the ways in sports nutrition and clinically in my practice that we avoid hyponatremia is by not drinking a bunch of plain water and adding in an appropriate amount of electrolytes and making sure our fluid intake is appropriate. But then this article basically spends a lot of time talking about how we don't need electrolytes, you just need to drink plain water. So it's very confusing because basically if my endurance athletes were to go follow this advice and just say, New York Times said I just have to drink plain water, and not worry about sodium, they would be more at risk to hyponatremia. So it's very confusing. And then they also talk about how hyponatremia can occur in some endurance athletes, and that, is basically the population it's more likely to occur in. But then also addresses how endurance athletes from the studies they're referencing on endurance athletes don't need sodium. It's very confusing. So in my neck of the woods, hyponatremia is actually not rare at all. It's even something that I would consider a common threat at like big endurance events if you're not educated properly on proper hydration. Up to 7 to 15% of endurance athletes can suffer or be at risk for hyponatremia. So that's not that rare. And how we avoid that is we avoid drinking a ton of plain water. So we make sure that we have sodium on board so that we're not just over diluting our blood volume, essentially. And that advice is just not given in this article. So another thing that they talk about is basically making sure that you avoid sports drinks that have too much sugar. So again, very confusing because the article's it's not clear on who they're talking to. From my perspective, they're talking to the general public, and I would typically agree with that. In the general public, they're talking about reducing your sugar consumption, and the article states that some sports drinks have just as much or more sugar as like a soda. And yeah, I agree with that. If you are not exercising, you're a very sedentary person, yeah, drinking a ton of sugary substances in our beverages isn't necessarily going to be health promoting if it's done consistently all the time, very often. And when you're reaching for something that is marketed as a healthy electrolyte, health benefiting containing sports drink, if you're just not knowledgeable, you might think this drink is going to make me athletic, this drink is going to make me healthy. Yeah, that's not true. Like that is marketing at its finest, not doing you any favors. But I know again, the not key audience of this article, but a lot of you definitely read it anyway, is that endurance athlete who's listening to this podcast episode, right? So I don't agree with that, of course. We absolutely want our sports drinks and our fueling strategies to contain carbohydrates. That's just essential for performance. That is demonstrated over and over and over again in the research. And in medical research too. So we definitely don't need to worry about beverages containing sugar when we are an endurance athlete because you are not a sedentary person. You are burning through carbohydrates, you are exercising, and we definitely need to be considering that while we're exercising. And having glucose or sugar in your sports drink actually enhances its ability to hydrate you properly. So if you even just were to Google right now, oral rehydration solution sounds super medical because it is. This is medically what they use to replace hydration in individuals who need it in the hospital, but it can also be used out in the field or for athletes. Oral rehydration solutions exist for a reason, and they contain sodium, water, and sugar. And that is because the sodium helps be an electrolyte to basically help keep your blood volume balanced. So does the fluid. We're losing both of those things in sweat. And sugar, aka glucose, basically helps all of that go where it's supposed to go and work better. And it also gives us some energy, which is a bonus. So I disagree with that statement from an endurance athlete standpoint. No, I don't think we necessarily need to worry about the sugar content of our sports drinks. In fact, we probably want there to be some carbohydrates, aka sugar, in our sports drinks. But yeah, sure, for general population who's not exercising, I don't really think we necessarily need a super sugary sports drink. Maybe a little bit of carbohydrates in the diet and some sodium that's on the food already and drinking plain water is going to help hydrate you perfectly fine because your losses aren't that extreme. Unless, of course, you're having extreme bouts of diarrhea, then that would be extreme. And you would probably want a oral rehydration solution like Pedialyte or Gatorade Endurance, or even just plain Gatorade if you're not super active. This could be like if you have the stomach flu or food poisoning. Those would be maybe good times to use an oral rehydration solution. You can also check out the link in the show notes. I have a video on how to make your own oral rehydration solution at home. You can make your own DIY sports drink that is appropriate for endurance athletes and or sedentary folks who have diarrhea or both. So if you can't catch my tone, I'm joking, but I'm actually not. You can check out the link in the show notes. I do have a video on that. That is obviously geared towards endurance athletes to use as a sports drink. It's super cheap to make, and you can make it in a pinch if you don't have access to a manufactured product. But jokingly, if you're just not an endurance athlete and you're super sedentary and you have the stomach flu, you could also use this too. If you have both, if you're an endurance athlete who has the stomach flu, you could also use this. The article also creates a little bit of fear mongering. It talks about how electrolyte companies are basically just marketing gimmicks and none of them are third party tested, and they can be contaminated. And again, I do agree with this. I do think we want to be, discerning when it comes to where we're getting our supplements from because they are not they do not have to be third party tested in the US and they're not regulated by the FDA specifically. So we do want to, look for supplements that are third party tested when we can. You can look for things like Informed Sport or NSF for Sport certified. Labdoor is another decent one. So those are some labels that you can look for. I mean, luckily too, with sports drinks, I don't know if it's luckily, but if it is like a drink at the grocery store or in a gas station, typically it's going to be, if it has like a nutrition facts panel and it's pre-made in a bottle, typically that is going to fall under FDA regulation. If it is like a powder in a canister, it's got like a supplement facts panel. That's a supplement that's probably not regulated by the FDA. A lot of the companies that you hear me and other sports dietitians talking about that are powders like Tailwind, Scratch, even Gatorade Endurance, they're somewhere in the middle. A lot of them are more supplement facts, and they, do need to go through third-party testing. Some of those do have that NSF for sport label. Some of them do not. They tend to be companies that I trust because I am in contact with them, or I use them, my athletes use them and have good success, or I've looked at consumer lab reports and they haven't found any contaminants in them, even if they're not tested by NSF for sport or informed sport, which are very expensive labels to acquire when you are a small startup, which a lot of these companies are. So it's not a perfect science, but that's something that I try to stay on top of so that if something is contaminated or there is an issue like there was with the spring energy gels, I can let you guys know and you can change and pivot your choices. What I don't love is that they talk about how, there's one study where muscle milk was given to athletes and it was found to contain higher amounts of arsenic than what were considered healthy. And then the study goes on to show that all the athletes were fine and there was no harm done essentially from the arsenic in the muscle milk. So it just kind of creates some fear mongering over a specific supplement that actually is NSF for sport certified now. So maybe they changed their formula, but I don't love that. I think that, when we're talking again to endurance athletes, we want to talk about, third-party testing, where to look for supplements, and that it's okay if they contain some of these things, but we don't want really high levels because again, salt is coming from the earth. So it's probably going to have some mineral and metal contamination, but we want it to be minimal. And if there's no harm done, then that's good. I think it was just like a weird call out. I don't know. I didn't love that. Even though I call out companies on third-party testing really often, but typically it's because there's been liver injury reported or like other health issues, and that's why it's been reported to the FTC. But I don't know. This is just like an interesting call out. And then they didn't cite a study on the Gatorade claim that they made, that Gatorade was contaminated with arsenic, and I couldn't find anything about that. So I don't know that that's necessarily true. So I've been rambling, and I want to wrap this up. My key takeaways, too long, didn't read. I didn't know what that acronym stood for, by the way, until like last year. I was like, I feel like I probably write a lot of things that are too long, didn't read, and didn't know what that meant because I always read. So anyway, my takeaways from this that you can walk away with are: one, please, please, please discern who you are getting advice from. Yes, New York Times, a lot of people want to think of as a very reliable source. However, think about their target audience. Is it endurance athletes? No. So should we be getting like sports nutrition information from New York Times? Like probably not. Probably not exclusively, especially if when it comes out, most of the professionals in the field are not agreeing with it and citing research to prove otherwise. So just like discern who you're getting it from. If it's a Runner's World article and it's obviously targeted towards endurance athletes and all of the professionals in the field are still not agreeing with it, yeah, then I think it's good informed, and still take it with a grain of salt, pun intended. But you could probably expect at least that type of publication to be talking to endurance athletes specifically and not trying to talk to everyone, which is what this article was doing and did so very unsuccessfully. Two is, I will say, when it comes to this topic, I've talked about this a lot. I've even talked about it on the show before. But when it comes to the topic of electrolytes, I do generally agree with the ethos of the article in that, do most sedentary people in the US need electrolytes from a supplement? No, I don't think so. Do most sedentary people in the US consume a diet that's void of produce and therefore potentially high in sodium because it's a lot of processed foods and packaged foods? Yeah, we've got data to show that. So yeah, I agree. They probably are able to get plenty of sodium from food. They don't need to be adding, an element packet to their water that's got an extra 1,000 milligrams of sodium in it. That may not be health promoting. Do I have a bone to pick with companies like Element and companies like Liquid IV and companies like Gatorade marketing their products to the masses and promoting them as health promoting products to the masses. Yeah, I do have a problem with that because, again, the masses don't need an extra 1,000 milligrams of sodium necessarily. Could some people with certain health conditions? Sure. But most people probably don't need this. And it's just another thing for them to buy. Marketing madness, essentially. That's not actually really going to help and may actually raise their blood pressure, cause other issues. So don't love that. Whenever I'm listening to a podcast that has nothing to do with like sports, it's like a lifestyle podcast or just a general health podcast, or even if it's like something totally unrelated, like book reviews or something like that, and there's like an Element ad, I'm like, ugh, why? Why is there an Element ad on this podcast talking to people who probably don't even really exercise? Like that's just unnecessary. And they're often promoting it as like a hangover cure or something that's super health promoting. And it's like, if we're drinking that much that we have a hangover, that's not healthy. Why don't we stop doing that? And then maybe we don't need the Element, which also is not really anything special. And is actually very expensive. So I have a bone to pick with that. I don't think that's right. As someone who used to work in a more clinical setting and give low sodium diet educations every day, yeah, I agree. I don't think the general population needs a ton of extra supplemental sodium in their diet. Now, when I'm talking to you guys, which is my endurance athlete population, who are, exercising for multiple hours per week, probably even sometimes multiple hours per day, and training for things like marathons, yeah, you absolutely would benefit from electrolyte supplementation. In fact, a lot of you, like I said, are having a hard time meeting it through your diet. I do find too with endurance athletes, a lot of people are a little bit more health conscious and therefore maybe eating more fruits and vegetables, particularly my population who maybe has a disordered relationship with food and is struggling with that and has an overconsumption of fruits and vegetables and is really struggling to get enough minerals in their diet from things like salt and protein that can be found in more processed or packaged foods or convenience foods or supplements. And maybe who's just under consuming food in general. So yeah, my population, who I talk to all the time now, has a really hard time meeting their electrolyte needs because their electrolyte needs are so much higher than the general population, and their diet is much less and lower in sodium and potentially general energy. So yeah, they could absolutely benefit from something like Element or Liquid IV or something that's got extra sugar and extra sodium in it because we need more of that and we're having a hard time getting in. So boom, convenient way to do that. Very health promoting. So very nuanced conversation. When I'm listening to a podcast that is for endurance athletes and is for super active people and they have like an Element ad or an electrolyte ad, I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like a lot of people should probably go try that out. But yeah, general population podcasts, I'm like, what are we doing? So my general bone to pick with this whole topic is that we need to have more nuanced conversations about it. And I think basically in this article, the New York Times attempted to do that and failed because it just seemed to confuse a lot of people. If I was a just general consumer reading this and I was not an endurance athlete, I would probably walk away from this thinking, oh, okay, I don't need to consume electrolytes. I should just drink plain water. I'm going to maybe 2 like boot camp classes per week, but that's really it. I don't need to worry about that. And that would be correct from my dietitian perspective. However, if I'm an active person, who may or may not identify as an endurance athlete. I could be someone who's going to Orange Theory Fitness 5 or 6 times per week, and I'm super obsessed with those types of workouts, and I'm exercising for 6 or 7 hours a week, but I don't necessarily identify as an endurance athlete. Or I'm an endurance athlete who's running, 20, 30, 40, 50 plus miles per week, which some of you don't identify as endurance athletes, even though you should, because you're exercising for a long time. Both of those people might read this and think, I'm confused, but it seems like since they have some sports like references in here, that I don't need to consume electrolytes. And I disagree with that. I don't think that's correct at all. I think you absolutely need to worry about consuming electrolytes. I've helped thousands of people with their hydration and fueling plans. and myself included, consuming adequate electrolytes before, during, and after your activity, but especially during and after, will only benefit your performance, your health, your recovery, and your overall well being. And supplements can be really helpful to help you do this. And plain water isn't going to be good enough over time as you accumulate that stress, that sweat loss, and that fatigue. So, hopefully those takeaways help. But I agree with everyone in my DMs in terms of when I read this as a professional, I was confused. I was like, I don't really know who they're trying to talk to here, but I get why people are very confused. And I think for the general public, this might have been a helpful article and it might help people stop buying a ton of high sodium supplements they don't need if they're not super active. But I do think for the niche amount of people who are in the endurance space who happen to read this article, I think it was probably really problematic. And me and my colleagues who are also sports dietitians are going to be undoing the damage from this one in a while. So, New York Times, if you do want to consult sports dietitians who work with endurance athletes and you want to come out with an article that says, do you need to drink electrolytes as an endurance athlete? We would be more than happy to help you steer the ship back on track in our neck of the woods because you did confuse a lot of our population, but we can fix it. We can totally fix it. So hit us up if you need some consultation. But if you guys are looking for support with your nutrition, with your fueling strategy, with your hydration plan, especially if you're super confused right now, I've got a ton of free resources on this. I'm going to link a couple blog posts in my show notes so you can go and read more about the nuance of how to understand how much sodium and fluids you need to support your training and how to adjust that using things like electrolyte supplements. If you want more personalized support, maybe you've got a race coming up or you've read the free stuff and you're still kind of confused and struggling or have some symptoms, I'm going to leave a link to work with us one-on-one in our nutrition coaching programs below. We offer both single consultations and also packages of consultations. My team sports dietitian Erica does have availability right now, currently speaking in August of 2025, some limited availability for one-on-one clients in her long-term packages. So I will link those below as well if you are needing more support. Hopefully this one was helpful. Hopefully you go have some electrolytes because we are in the middle of summer marathon training right now, and Lord knows the people listening to this podcast probably need it. Until next time, happy running.